Welcome, whether you're here with us at the Library of Congress or joining us online. I'm Ian Chapman, Chinese Reference Librarian from the Asian Division. Today, the Asian Division of the Library of Congress and the Library of Congress Asian American Association are honored to welcome a friend from afar, all the way from California, Belinda Huijuan Tang. Author of the acclaimed 2022 novel, A Map for the Missing, Belinda will speak today on her endeavor as a writer to recover the dreams and agency of individuals in turbulent political times in a talk entitled The Personal and Political, Exploring Familial and National History in a Fictional Lens. Belinda Huijuan Tang earned a BA from Stanford University in economics, which perhaps helped her capture the calculus-like cognition of her math professor protagonist. Belinda later earned an MA in Chinese Studies from Peking University, focusing on politics and international relations. It's somewhat striking that characters in the novel whose lives are impacted so profoundly by both politics and international relations so rarely engage directly with these. Belinda is also a graduate of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow and recipient of the Missioner Copernicus Fellowship. Her novel, A Map for the Missing, published by Penguin Random House in 2022, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's 2022 First Novel Prize. She has published various non-fiction essays and taught creative writing. She is also active in community service. Please join me in welcoming Belinda Huijuan Tang.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And also thank you so much to Dr. Dongfang Xiao here at the Library of Congress Asian Division. It's such a generous invitation. I'm so honored to be here. I wanted to say it's a privilege to be invited here to speak today. I'm not a scholar, and so I'm not a scholar of Chinese literature, as some people in the audience are. And so as I was preparing this talk, I was trying to think of what unique contribution I could have and what I'd like to be able to contribute. So what I thought I would do was share some of my thoughts as a writer about my processes in doing so, my experiences. So this isn't going to be an analytical speech per se. It's going to be more of a personal one. So the idea for this lecture came from the challenges of writing my first book. For those of you who don't know, publicity for a book is an extremely discomforting experience. One of the things that happens is you're turned from an artist who has a process, which includes any set of doubts about their own work, to a salesperson who can't evince any kind of evidence of defect nor question about your work. And so I think it's a really difficult experience, actually, and I want to do something different today, which is to share with you some of the challenges I thought I had when I was writing this book and the ways that I went about thinking about these challenges, including other books that I turned to as sources of inspiration as I was writing this. So of course there were all the questions around matters of craft, around things like how to create suspense in the book and how to achieve tension and point of view. But because this talk is being hosted by the Asian Division of the Library of Congress, and also because they were amongst my biggest concerns as I was writing, I wanted to speak specifically about my experience writing about Chinese characters living during a difficult time in Chinese history. So for those of you who don't know, my book, A Map for the Missing, is set largely in China at the very end of the Cultural Revolution in the late 1970s. And the book also discusses characters' memories of the time beforehand during the Cultural Revolution itself. When I realized the story I wanted to write was going to be set at least partially in the Cultural Revolution, I was really scared, actually. Part of this was because it takes a tremendous amount of research to write about any historical era. But I was really worried about writing about the Cultural Revolution specifically because so much writing about modern China, both in fiction and nonfiction, is about this era. either that or about the massacre at Tiananmen. And to be honest, I have a lot of issues with a lot of that writing. And so this was the fundamental question that haunted me all throughout writing this novel, and one that has continued to affect me even now, long after the novel is done, because as I'm doing publicity, a lot of questions arise as to how the novel exists in the world. So when I first started thinking about the idea for this book, I thought of this book in terms of the individual characters who inspired it. This story is set largely in rural China in Anhui province. Half of it is set there, and then half of it is set in America in 1993. So in 1993, my protagonist, Tang Yitian, discovers that his estranged father has gone missing back in China. The part of the book set in China in the late 1970s tells the story of their estrangement, largely over disagreements of Yitian attending college. So that story probably sounds pretty simple. It's a personal story about family dynamics. It's a classic conflict between one and one's children over values. The problem is that values aren't really a wholly personal thing, as much as perhaps we Americans might like to think so. They're dictated by one's time. And the circumstances of one's time are inevitably dictated by the politics of that time. For example, consider the context surrounding the estrangement. Yitian is part of the 1977 Gaokao class, the first year to attend college in China in 20 years after a long hiatus in access to higher education during the Cultural Revolution. So already the fact that this issue comes up for him and his father at this time is a consequence of that time's political situation. Then there are the values that the individual characters hold themselves. Part of why Yitian's father is so distrustful of education and doesn't want his son to pursue it is because he sees it and the educated as living in a precarious state after watching the tumult that was inflicted on educated people during the period of the Cultural Revolution. Of course, people could say the same of his life as a farmer. The rural areas were, of course, by no means exempt from political danger, but for him, what is safe is what he already knows. So it was clear to me that the politics of the time greatly influenced the lives of my characters, and that writing about these characters would require alluding to what was going on in Beijing. But then I bumped up on another question, which was how to write about the politics of the time without the characters becoming mere ciphers for the politics. It's not an empty concern, and it's one that feels especially loaded when it comes to portraying any Chinese character, especially from the West, and I am someone who is writing in English for English-speaking audiences. And I've seen it firsthand, the desire to read the characters in this book entirely in terms of politics. Since the release of the book, I've participated in numerous Q&As where one of the first questions asked is always about some aspect of Chinese politics that has no relevance to the characters of my book. I've been asked about Peng Shuai and Xi Jinping. Whether I have answers to such questions is ultimately irrelevant. The proclivity towards such questions is an indication to me that the reader cannot see beyond the character as a symbol, that a specific Chinese person living in a specific Chinese time becomes nothing more than generally Chinese with the centuries of baggage that such a label carries. This demonstrates a disturbing trend that Elaine Castillo writes very well about in her essay, How to Read Now, something that afflicts not only Chinese writers, but writers of color and writers writing outside the center more generally. She writes, "We go to writers of color for the gooey heart porn of the ethnographic, to learn about forgotten history, harrowing tragedy, community-destroying political upheaval, genocide, trauma. We expect those writers to provide those intellectual commodities the way their ancestors once provided spices, minerals, precious stones, and unprecious bodies." Of course, there's nothing particularly new about this method of readership as it applies to authors from marginalized groups. The tendency has always been that characters from the majority are able to exist as whole individual people who have their own interests, proclivities, and personality quirks, while characters from the margins instead are burdened with standing in for that entire margin. Every marginalized group deals with this in their own way. When it comes to writing about Chinese characters, if this tendency exists in literature, I believe it's no more than a reflection of a broader tendency that suffuses the discussion of Chinese people and Chinese lives. I can hardly pass a New York Times article about China that doesn't bring up the Cultural Revolution or Tiananmen, even when it seems miles away from the topic at hand. And I saw this too when I lived in China. I was a part of a master's program that brought together students from many countries. One of my classmates is actually here today in the audience. Inevitably, most of the foreign students want to talk about Tiananmen and the Cultural Revolution. Of course, these are two watershed moments in the lives of Chinese people in the last century. However, many of my classmates saw no room for Chinese people to exist outside of these political events. Chinese people were filtered into buckets depending on if they were willing to talk about Tiananmen with a Westerner, and thus people became monoliths. By the way, an irony but non-accident of this is that this is the exact same activity that the CCP was engaged in during the Cultural Revolution, reducing specific people into archetypes and regarding individuals as nothing more than members of a revolutionary mass. So I think in a way we're all participating in flip sides of the same coin. This was all particularly interesting to me because for so long I felt a chasm between the portrayals of life during this era and the way that my own family has spoken about it. While the media portrayals showed life during the Cultural Revolution as ones completely defined by its oppressions, I heard other versions of stories of the way my parents grew up. Alongside the political stories, there were always other ones of celebration, of joy, of stealing watermelons from a neighbor's patch of land. There was birth and death and graduation and marriage, and most notably, even when talking about the worst of times, my family did so often with a sense of humor. A note in their voice seemed to be saying, "Can you believe that things were like that? And what else?" It was important to me that I portrayed these moments in my book. That, alongside the pain of Yi Tian, who has wanted to pursue higher education for much of his life, but saw no hope for it until 1977. Alongside that, there was the love shown to him by his grandfather, who develops in him his love for learning, and also that shown to him by his brother, who endures great personal sacrifice in order to allow Yi Tian to pursue schooling. There's enjoyment of meals in spite of their relative poverty. There's drinking, there's fun, there's joking. In short, there were all the ways that people make their everyday lives. We aren't robots with trauma as input and tears as output, and there's room alongside the bureaucratic and government action that unfortunately dictated so much of their lives at that time and also our lives of this time, also for joy, laughter, envy, ego, pride, ease, peace, and well-being. So that was one thing I was thinking about. I didn't want the characters to become ciphers for politics, but neither did I want to present a false picture of these characters living under time without abuses of state power and as people who weren't affected by it. The ways choice was severely restricted during this period were very real. And I think we as writers have to walk a fine line in portraying individual humanity while also acknowledging that such humanity is never really separable from the political forces that shape people. If the portrayal of my westernized classmates was not true, neither is its inverse. I didn't want to fall into another trap, one that I think is very pervasive in some kinds of advice for writers of literary fiction, which I call the question of writing passive versus active characters. I live in LA now, and I do some work in screenwriting in addition to my fiction writing, and everyone in screenwriting is obsessed with this idea of writing an active character. For your characters to be deemed too passive is one of the biggest critiques that your writing could get. There's a certain kind of story that's typically called too passive, a protagonist who experiences life essentially as a pinball in a pinball machine, someone who's pushed around from place to place, who sees life as a series of unfortunate events. All that she can do is react to the events and hope for the best. I've kind of seen this type of critique in fiction writing too. But there seems to be something distinctly American to me about this model of a story, to believe that one can always be the arbiter of their own individual destiny, that it's always possible to be an active agent in your life. The reality is that people are born every day in places, including this country, that are denied all variety of choice because of structures that oppress their agency. And it seems highly disingenuous, even morally irresponsible, I would argue, to insist on a model of our storytelling that presents an inaccurate version of this reality. In Yi-Yin Lee's recent novel, The Book of Goose, an emigre writer to America considers this question. She remarks that people consider her a passive person. She's an immigrant from France. And she asks, "Am I passive? I've noticed that Americans are quick to call a person passive, which is never meant as a compliment. People handing out this verdict freely are those for whom any external movement is a sign of decisiveness, personal strength, and virtue. Earlier, she's remarked on her own definitions of a life. To me, anything that happens is life. This great cultural disconnect was something that came up in some comments readers have made to me about my book. They've told me actually that they find Etienne annoying because he's always kind of floating through his life, allowing things to happen to him. He takes the Gaokao in 1977 because it happens to be reinstated the year that he graduates from high school. In university, he studies math instead of his first love, history, because the bureaucracy happens to refuse him any option to change his major. He goes to America because a professor likes him and happens to nominate him for the opportunity. Many people have expressed to me that they wished Etienne would have taken more decisive action throughout the course of his life. And they say instead that their favorite character is Etienne's wife, Mali, who is I created her deliberately as a foil to him. She jumps into American life after they immigrate and is dedicated to finding ways for them to become more a part of the culture. To be frank, I always found Mali kind of annoying, even though I was the one who wrote her, and I could identify much more with Etienne. At least certainly his life more resembled the lives of people I really knew in this era, where accident and fate were the governing forces, not some individual's hero's journey. Etienne didn't remain a farmer in his village like everyone in the generations before him, for the same reason my own father didn't. They both happened into their lives. In contrast, I was struck by a few people in my parents' generation who've read this book, who've said Etienne's mother is the character that resonates most to them. This was somewhat interesting to me because in many ways, I think Etienne's mother is actually the most traditionally passive of the book. When Etienne returns to China after more than 15 years away, she allows her son to make most of the decisions in how to search for his father, her husband. And when the father's eventual fate is revealed, she offers far less resistance to the outcome than Etienne himself does. The people in my parents' generation who have read the book say that his mother resembles people they have known, for whom so much change has happened in their lifetimes that new surprises are somewhat easy to accept. Perhaps they don't evince the same kind of resistance when a new spate of bad luck befalls them. Although Etienne's mother isn't a central character in the book, I hope that I've implied she has an inner life beyond what we may see on the page, that it isn't only what's made it into the external world that makes one an agent in their own life. Merely the act of remembering, as she does, can be an act of agency. I don't believe that remembering or a lack of external action is passivity, but rather a form of agency and action in a different form. Embedded in that idea of active versus passive characters are implicit definitions of what it means to be active and passive. To be active, those critics imply, must involve action in the external world. There's no recognition of the possibility that the quality of being active can happen internally. Isn't it also active to remember, to interpret? What if I witness an event and then tell a story about it? Isn't that a way of taking action? Embedded into those definitions, too, is an assumption that everyone has the ability to take the same kinds of actions in the world outside. Once again, I think the criticism of passivity is very American and in fact props up a very American and capitalistic myth that we are the primary agents in our own lives. The implications of such a belief are obvious, the same as the reasons some people would like us to believe that if poor people simply tried harder, they wouldn't be poor. If things are our own fault, the results of our own action, then we don't have to challenge the structures of our world that have as much work in determining our fates as anything else. I have to admit that the criticism of writing passive characters is one that I've faced a lot. Many of my earliest short stories featured characters who were quiet and shy observers, watching and processing the actions of the more active people in their lives. So maybe this is a personal proclivity of mine, or maybe it's one that's somehow inherited. Most likely it's some sort of combination of both. But in any case, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question. One of my favorite authors is the British-Japanese writer, Nobel Prize-winning writer, I should say, Kazuo Ishiguro, whose work provides great evidence to me that it isn't passivity or activity in the external world that makes a great or even interesting novel. In two of his most famous books, The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, the protagonists are people living in circumstances without much access to agency. The first follows a British butler who only has decisions around the life of the house he oversees. He can decide what silverware to use, what room he might put guests in, and these are pretty much the extent of his purview in his life. In Never Let Me Go, the characters are clones raised for organ harvesting, people who have had no choice about their bodies or lives since the day they were born. Certainly, these characters are not active in a traditional sense. They cannot influence their fate in the external world. It's notable instead that both the protagonists of these books, near the end of their lives, put their faith in the act of remembering. Kathy G., our clone protagonist, states, "Memories, even your most precious ones, fade surprisingly quickly. But I don't go along with that. The memories I value most, I don't ever see them fading. Against the passive act of forgetting, she insists on remembering. And it should also be noted, these books are no less entertaining for their reliance on passive characters." There's another gripe I have with the ways that mainstream writing gives advice on the question of activity versus passivity. By saying there's only one thing that counts as action, we also implicitly say there's only one way to live, that these lives with decisions made in different realms and of different significances lack some sort of gravitas. As Stevens, the British butler, says so well, "The hard reality is surely that for the likes of you and I, there is little choice other than to leave our fate, ultimately, in the hands of those great gentlemen at the hub of this world who employ our services. What is the point in worrying oneself too much about what one could or could not have done to control the course one's life took? Surely it is enough that the likes of you and I at least try to make our small contribution count for something true and worthy. And if some of us are prepared to sacrifice much in life in order to pursue such aspirations, surely that is in itself, whatever the outcome, cause for pride and contentment." Against this, the literature about the oppressed that insists on documenting its humanity in specific lives itself is a kind of action that one decides to take in the face of all the ways action is denied people. To look for examples of this, I looked at books where a book within a book tells the story of the character. One of those was Valeria Lucili's Lost Children Archive, which deals with the migrants' children's crisis in the modern day. It's set in an era where it's easy to feel powerless, to believe that one's actions as an individual are small and trivial against the forces of oppression. But it also offers a version of an answer to that question. It argues that to remember and to keep a record is in itself an active response. As the narrator states, "Stories don't fix anything or save anyone, but maybe they make the world both more complex and more tolerable. And sometimes, just sometimes, more beautiful. Stories are a way of subtracting the future from the past, the only way of finding clarity in hindsight." More complex, more tolerable, more beautiful. These are all ways of saying that stories make the world more livable. A story is a record that says, "I have lived." Another book that features the story within a story model is called Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Tian. It's an excellent book about Tiananmen. The narrator of that book states, "The things you experience are written on your cells as memories and patterns, which are reprinted again on the next generation. And even if you never lift a shovel or plant a cabbage, every day of your life, something is written upon you." Neither of these books claim that stories make up for the destruction of real life or fix it, and I would never go so far to make so bold a claim about fiction. How could stories fix all that's wrong in the world? But they are evidence that it's powerful and even essential to engage in the act of description, of deciding that no matter how hard the present is to face, to document and make meaning of it is important. So to summarize, the major question I had was this: if as a writer I was interested in a period where my characters experienced trauma, how did I make sure they wouldn't be defined by it? This is a paradox many writers face, and it's summarized well in James Baldwin's essay, Everyone's Protest Novel. We take our shape, it is true, within and against the cage of reality bequeathed us at our birth, And yet it is precisely through our dependence on this reality that we are most endlessly betrayed. The answer I had in the end, as I approached this question, was perhaps a simple one. I gave the same questions I asked myself as a writer to my characters. If I, separated by time and distance, wondered what it felt like to have dreams in times lacking political choice, my characters living in those times must have felt that weight as well. They weren't ignorant of their times, after all. I know that there were people with dreams who lived through this time. My parents and their stories are just a few examples of this. And maybe the shape of their dreams was different from mine, but I believe that this is a near universal emotion. Why then wouldn't they ask themselves, what should I do with this dream? Should I store it away, and dare I hope to have it? In writing this book, I felt it was instructive to look at writers who were from China and were thus writing to a mainly Chinese audience. They could write without all the baggage I had because they did not need to worry so much about what their character might represent to people who don't know this part of history. One of the epigraphs of my book is taken from the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, a masterpiece by the author Wang Anyi. Commenting on her characters who lived through World War II and then the communist takeover, she writes, "They didn't want to create a place for themselves in history, they wanted to create themselves." It's not only me as a writer who will wonder whether my characters can be free of the shackles of history or to what extent they can be agents of their own lives. Each person will find a different answer to that, driven as much from their own decisions as by chance and happenstance. But the answer remains, and the question must be relevant to my characters because they are relevant to individuals themselves. And if my goal, finally, is to write specific characters, there's no reason they shouldn't also consider how they stand against that background that is also foreground of history. So I created Yitian and Hanwen, my two protagonists, and had them discuss the same questions that I've asked in this talk. They asked themselves what would have been different if they'd been born into other eras or even lived in a different place in their own era. It was important to me, too, that the characters didn't allow their trauma to define them. Hanwen is a member of the sent-down youth generation who were forced from their urban homes into the rural areas where the Communist Party wanted them to learn. It was a traumatic time for very many, and yet there were others who reflected on their time sent down with fondness. I spoke to very many from that latter group who in fact viewed their time in the rural areas as definitive in their life. Despite the difficulty of being away from their family, they enjoyed the rural way of life and the people it brought them in contact with. Hanwen is one of those people who expresses a kind of gratitude for the days she spent in the countryside and is willing to see the ways that her life was marked for the better because of it. I don't mean to suggest that the policy was excusable or a positive experience for even most, only that people are varied and varied experiences exist. And as a writer, it's my responsibility not to pretend that there is any monolithic view of an event. My answer to these questions of agency, history, and politics is by no means complete. I'm open to the criticism that I've portrayed characters living in a more glowy version of this period of history than would be actually responsible. Certainly, there are people who had it much worse during the Cultural Revolution than the characters of my book. And some will view it as irresponsible for me to write a book in English that will no doubt be consumed by some people unfamiliar to this era of history and who will assume that the story I tell is representative of it all. To those critics, I would say that I reject the responsibility to be a spokesperson for history. And I'd like to conclude by offering some of my own thoughts from my writing practice of how I get through these kinds of questions when I face them every day. You're probably sitting here and thinking by now, wow, this woman really gets in her own head and can't just sit down and write a story. It's true, sometimes it's really hard to be in my head, and I do get caught up in doubts that I'll never get it right. When I can, however, I think of something that writers from the centers of our society will likely never think of these kinds of questions. When I was a kid, I was very stubborn and would always give my parents hell if I thought something wasn't fair, like why did my brother get more candy than I did on Halloween? And I still am, in a lot of ways, obsessed with this idea of fairness. Why should writers from the center get to be the only ones who write in a carefree manner? When I'm able to then, I remind myself I can write as if I'm writing from the majority. And I believe that this is the only way out of the conundrum, to let go of the shackles of representation and assert unconditionally my right to be here and to document our experiences. Thank you. So I guess I'll take some questions now if anyone has them. I'm happy to talk about my book or anything I spoke about. Yeah.
Hi, Belinda. It's so good to see you in person. I have a question mainly about actually what you were talking about at the end of your talk about your writing process and how you see yourself not in the peripheral but in the center. So in the novel, Etienne maps out his journey finding his father, and there are interweaving, graphs that you involve, and a recounting of oral histories, and also flashbacks. And so, as the author, how did you map out the storyline and progression of the novel? And did anything in the story change while you were writing it that surprised you?
Yeah. So to answer the first question about mapping up the story, I originally actually wrote the book chronologically from 1978 to 1993, and that actually made it a lot easier. And there was a whole section in the book that I wrote that took place in the 80s when Etienne was actually in college, that never made it into the final draft of the book. So all of that stuff really helped, I think, enrich the characters. And to give me an idea of their histories as it influenced the plot. I'm telling myself a lot of this right now because I'm working on another book that I've written 5 drafts of, and each of the 5 drafts kind of takes place in a different part of this person's life, and I have to keep telling myself that even if all of this stuff doesn't make it into the final version of the book, it is all stuff that influences my knowledge of this character and how they act, and it's really actually essential to the book as it reaches its final state and gives it that sense of this is a complete person living in the world. I think also writing this book, A Map for the Missing specifically, was a little bit easier because I think people's lives at this moment, at this period, were so defined by history. It made it easier for me to think through big political events and then where the characters might be when that happened and how it would affect their lives. And so those acted kind of as anchors when I was writing, as things that I could go to, and as things that I could kind of hang the structure of the book upon. And it's my hope that by the end of the book, the structure isn't so clear to readers that you see all of those things, but at least when I'm drafting, it helps to have that as something that I return to as I'm drafting. What was the second question?
Oh, it was how did anything surprise you while you were drafting it where you realized oh, actually, this little plot twist or a little switch that you didn't think a character was going to experience?
Yeah, so many, I think. And that was actually a really good sign to me, I think, because writing a book is it's a good sign for 2 reasons. I think, one, it was a good sign for the book to me because it meant to me the characters are kind of taking on their own life and having their own ideas and surprising me in this way. And then second, it was really important for me personally as I was writing because it just takes so long to write a book. And if you just feel like you're executing every day according to a plan rather than being surprised by the characters or being surprised by new ideas, I think writing a novel can actually feel really tedious and not very fun. So a lot of things happened really within the first 2 chapters of the book. I don't want to provide any spoilers or anything because everyone should go buy the book. But Etienne's brother, Yisho, he performs this act of enormous sacrifice for Etienne, and that was not something I had in mind when I started writing.
Wow, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, Belinda. I was wondering whether you wrote the book knowing how you wanted to end it. without revealing any spoilers, to the extent that you can answer the question that way.
Yeah, I did actually know how I wanted to end it quite soon after I started the book. And I think that really works for me well because it helps me to think, okay, I have something that I'm writing towards, and it helps just make every day go easier. And that idea of an ending might change as I'm writing the book. With this book, it didn't. With the book that I'm working on right now, it has changed. But as long as I have some picture of how the book will finish, I feel like I can make it through these torturous days. Sometimes torturous.
Hey, Belinda. It's great to see you, and congratulations on the novel. Thought it was wonderful, and it was a wonderful talk. Everything you said resonated with me. I think, kind of piggybacking off what she just said, I thought as I was reading the novel, one of the things that stood out to me the most was just how strong the connective, unseen tissue was, right? You know, the iceberg beneath the water, beneath the surface was just so strong, and I think that you kind of talked about how you do that, and I thought that was beautiful. What was my question? Oh, yeah. The last thing that you mentioned in the talk just now was about just releasing the shackles, right? And allowing yourself to say, I belong to be here, my perspective, my voice deserves to be heard. But I think you talked about earlier about how in this industry, the marginalized perspectives and voices are kind of commodified, and they want to see certain things. Publishers, readers want to see certain things. How did you battle against that feeling of like, oh, well, if I don't write in this commodified way as a marginalized voice and perspective, will I be able to get published?
Yeah, it's really hard, I think, because you see what kinds of stuff is out there, and it really feels a lot of times like, oh, this is us. You see, like, this is the kind of story they want, and that's not even just in writing. It's like you see it in movies, you see it in all kinds of art. And I think what really helps me is that I feel really strongly that I don't want to make bad art. Like, I don't want to contribute to this. And if I didn't get so angry when I watched stuff that I felt was pandering or read stuff that I feel like is pandering, I don't think I would be as motivated against it. But I get so angry. It really frustrates me. I think right now, especially because I live in LA, I see it so much in the screenwriting world around what kinds of stories they want from Asian characters. And I see so much stuff that comes out that feels like an outgrowth of that, and I really don't like it. I feel like, why are we wasting our time doing this? And so it just feels really important for me to not contribute to that and to try to do something that feels important to me. Like, if I was gonna, give into that sense of what is going to be well received or what I know will be really easily palatable, I feel like I might as well have gone and be a lawyer, and fulfilled my mom's dreams.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that observation on blaming individuals for their life circumstances. And we're entering a time where we're not only not acknowledging that, but trying to erase the history that brought people to their current situation. Philadelphia Public Schools has remaining one librarian for 217 schools. It's 1,000% censorship. So we have a group, Philadelphia Alliance to Restore School Librarians. If you want to look into that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's interesting. I like that you kind of use that word censorship, because it reminds me just that censorship, or the quieting of voices, happens in all sorts of forms, and it's not always the big name banned books types of censorship. It happens in really mundane ways, like cutting funding, and that really reduces access to knowledge in a way that is, the effects are equally as damaging. Yeah, so thank you.
Okay, I'm going to repeat a couple of questions from participants online.
Okay.
Number one, from Lorraine Tong. Excellent presentation, Belinda. Thank you. Your subject
Lauren.
matter and writing process are insightful. How do you determine when to stop with many drafts? Also, what is a good email to reach you?
You can reach, there's a contact form on my website, and that goes directly to my email, so that's the easiest way to reach me. The question about the drafts is really a good question that I don't have a good answer to, I think. I think in the process of writing a map for the missing, the draft that I landed on was the one where I felt like I can't really push any further. Like I've given, at least at this moment, all that I have to give. But now that it's been like almost 3 years since I finished the draft, I feel like I could go back and write up the book again, or that I would have new ideas for it. And I've heard writers say similar things about their books. A writer that I really love, Akhil Sharma, just re-released his first novel that came out like more than 20 or 30 years ago and completely rewrote it. So I think at the time, yeah, it felt like just intuitively I didn't have any more to write. And this Etienne's story especially felt like it was completed, both emotionally and on the plot. But I think in real life, oftentimes when drafts are done is just when you feel like you're tired of working on something, and also maybe you need money, so you need to go sell your book. I know that's not a very romantic answer, but I think that is the truth when I look out there. Yeah.
Well, question number 2 from Anne Roddy. May I ask if you please talk about your book from the perspective of history reflected by the imagination?
Oh, I see Anne is like a scholar. Could they kind of give some more context for the question? I'm not sure if I know what it means, what the question means, to be honest. The perspective of history refracted through the imagination. I suppose the book is an act of history refracted through the imagination. I would start by saying that.
Okay, shall I go to the number?
Yeah.
Okay.
If she gets back to you,
Okay,
we'll go back to her. Yeah.
Number 3 from Jesselyn Zoom. You attended the renowned Iowa Writers Workshop. How did the training and experience there help shape your journey as a writer?
Yeah, I think it was really, I got a lot of good training there, a lot of great craft advice that shaped this book in specific ways. But I think the most important thing that I got, and that I think people from any MFA program can get, I don't think this is by any means specific to that one, is a sense of taking my writing seriously and seeing my work as art that existed outside of just something I was doing for fun on my computer. It really meant a lot to me to be in workshops every week where people took my work seriously and talked about it as if it was something that existed out in the world and had thoughts about what the characters were doing. I think that might not be so important for many people. I think some people maybe start writing and already have innately that sense of their writing as something that will be published and exists outside of themselves. But for me, I really needed that, and it was being in a community of artists who were talking about art and books all the time and who talked about my work seriously and who allowed me to discuss their work seriously that gave me the confidence to be a writer.
All right, question number 4 from Joyce Share. Are there ways that your characters represent universal family interactions or have individual rites of passage that might be common outside your Asian context?
Yeah, I've certainly had people speak to me about how some of the emotions and relationships expressed in the book felt resonant to them in their own cultures. But I did write it from a Chinese perspective, or at least what the Chinese perspective of my imagination. And so I can't say that anything was intended to be universal in it. I received an interesting email a couple months ago from a Chinese man who lived through this period and said actually that he had a lot of resonances to this story, and he said the book was really brought up a lot of memories for him of China during this time, but he also wished that it would have been a more universal experience and not something so specific. And I thought that was an interesting comment to me. I never responded to his email, but it did make me think.
Thank you, Belinda. That's all from the online participants' questions.
Thank you. I think there's another question over here.
Hi, Belinda. Thank you so much for your talk. I was struck by something you said about the passive act of forgetting, which I thought is interesting because forgetting, I think, can be a willed act, and narratives or histories in particular are often shaped by the negative. I think neutrality requires exertion. I think silence is, in a way, a deliberate decision. So I'm wondering, I'm still trying to form a question, but like how you approach that and how you approach agency as something that can be used for the negative as well, or for something unproductive?
Yeah, I love that question. I love the way that you phrased it. I think in the book, as I saw it, like that's exactly right, that the agency the characters showed was oftentimes around this act of deciding not to remember these traumatic things that happened when they were like living through this period. And for them, that became the way that they moved through this time and dealt with it. But I think also the journey that the characters go on in the book is one kind of at least understanding the consciousness around forgetting. And I think that at the way that the book starts, that act of forgetting and the silences aren't done in a conscious way. And so I would hesitate in a way to assign that act, that word of agency around like an unconscious blinking of memory. And I think that more the work in terms of the agency that I'm talking about is around recognizing the things that you want to be silent about and recognizing the process through which like that loss of memory occurred and how it can be more willing rather than willful. Yeah. Thank you everyone for all the questions, and thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it.